All right. So next up, we have Ciara, who's going to chat to us about the right questions to ask as a software tester. Okay, over to you.
All good. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all good. Hi, I'm Ciara Luke, and today I'm going to be talking through some of the questions I explore as a software tester. I actually set out to become a web developer and just fell into the role of QA through an opportunity that presented itself to me about 7 years ago now at Rehab Studio. And I felt like I really adapted to the role. I loved how insightful it was and the different styles of thinking that were required. So yeah, 7 years later, I'm standing here today talking about software testing. So it's a good opportunity for me to share just some of my learnings. In this talk, I'm going to be talking about the what-if mindset and how that strongly links to positive and negative ways of thinking. For example, if I'd have let those negative, worried feelings overwhelm me when signing up to this particular presentation, I very well definitely wouldn't have been here today. So there's a time when we should think positively, and there's also a time when it's okay to think negatively, and that's very important when it comes to software testing. I'm also going to be touching on some of the different questions that we can ask about our users to better understand them and to really demonstrate that by taking the time and the effort to understand them, we can build better products and, most importantly, better experiences. So this next slide really sums up that software tester's mindset in that if something is likely to go wrong, it very much likely will go wrong. And I know growing up through university, I worked as a part-time gymnast coach, so we were responsible for laying out all the safety mats. And one particular day, the safety mats just didn't line up just right, so there was a small gap left underneath one of the beams. And my thinking was, well, the likelihood of anyone hurting themselves here is just so minimal, it's not really worth the effort going to shift it all around to fix it. And it was my gymnastics coach at the time, Mrs. Sterling, had pointed out that actually any risk is a big risk because by the end of the day, no matter how small that gap, one of those kids is going to end up falling in it. And when I look back on that, I think, she was absolutely right. And even when I take part in software testing, that's the mindset I like to carry because no matter how small a bug, if it's out there, somebody's going to find it. And so it's really about adapting to that mindset and becoming more observative and starting to be able to predict where some of these errors are likely to occur. And so this brings me to the what-if mindset. So we as people, we try to go through life in a positive way. At least that's the aim anyway. I'm sure we've all had our fair share of bad days. The point is, we certainly wouldn't get very far if we were constantly reflecting on that negative. If you look to the board here as an example, you can see how that mindset might really strongly affect that outcome. So asking questions like, well, what if I fall in the ditch? What if I don't make it? Or what if I don't do well at this interview? The questions we ask ourselves have such a powerful impact on what it is we achieve. And in case anybody's wondering, that is me up and underneath my bike there in the ditch. And it's my own personal example of where that mindset gets me from time to time because I do tend to question the ditches and how close those trees are. And this is usually the end result. So when it comes to sports and life in general, carrying that positive mindset is important. You're not going to get somebody running towards a finishing line thinking, what if I fall? Quite the opposite. They're going to be thinking, what if I win? What if I really achieve this? Whereas when we take this negative what-if concept and apply that to software testing, we can find more areas for improvement. So let's take this concept and we'll apply it to software testing. And I'll first give you a quick demonstration between the difference of positive and negative testing. So positive testing looks for what is expected to happen, does actually happen. And this accounts for 80% of those user actions. A negative test then looks for unexpected ways of testing, and this accounts for 20% of those user actions. So here you can see we have a simple number input field. A positive test is going to check that you can in fact add numbers in here and submit successfully. Whereas a negative test is really going to want to explore this further and ask questions like, What if I add in characters? Or what if I add in a really long number? What about decimal places? Or what would happen if I added in an emoji here? And so you can start to see where that negative what if concept suddenly becomes useful. It's important to know that user actions, as we all know, they're not predictable. And research has found that you can actually find bugs in a system by testing that system in a way that makes absolute no sense. So the negative way of testing is definitely a very powerful way of testing. And so when we are taking a piece of software and starting to predict where some of these errors are likely to occur, it does help to put yourself into those users' shoes and ask questions. So you can see on the board here we have the famous scenario of who, what, where, and why. But they are really insightful questions to ask. Asking things like, well, who are users? What might their technical skills be like? What devices might they be using? And why are they using this particular application? Like, why is this so important to them? Really opens up areas for improvement. So we'll cover just a quick example of a running app. Here we have 3 different users, Bill, Ian, and Nora, all wanting to use this running app to track their fitness. So let's first highlight some of the key main differences here and think of ways that we could improve our tests. So first up is Bill. He's a 70-year-old pensioner who likes to go running in the mornings, but his eyesight isn't great. So automatically here I would be thinking of accessibility testing. And for anybody that doesn't know, accessibility testing is looking for faults in a system where somebody may really struggle to use that system. For example, a blind person may need to use a screen reader. Now, we don't know if that's the extent of Bill's needs here. I'm assuming because he's quite active and out running that those eyesight issues relate to reading. In any which case, I'd be making sure that that content is clear and easy to understand. Then we have Ian, a 30-year-old web developer, likes to use the latest technologies. So you could argue that a running application is going to carry a real high level of competition. So here, performance is going to be key and making sure that data is precise, as this type of user is just going to delete it otherwise and try something else. And then we have Nora, a 23-year-old student on an exciting year of travel. So immediately here, I'd be questioning the app's offline capability. We don't really know where somebody's travels are going to take them or what time zones they're crossing, so it's important to be aware that this could cause errors. So while these are 3 basic general examples, I just wanted to give you an example of when we take the time to think about who our users are, we can find ways for improvement. And so when we begin to understand who those users are, we can then begin to question something that's usually forgotten about, and that's the user's emotions. So I try to remember that the user journey is a very mental and lived-in experience. You could get somebody who's ecstatic because they're just out of lockdown and they're booking holiday tickets. Or you could get somebody cautious because they don't like to spend money, in which case we'd want to build trust into that site. Or you could have had somebody who's just had a horrendous day and they've come to fill in a form and they're clicking frantically about the screen. Well, that's likely to cause errors. So I always try to question how that user might be feeling and how it might affect that site. So if I am testing a system and going in as a frustrated user and clicking a button a few times, I want to make sure that no errors arise from that. So we've covered a few of the questions about the different types of users and better ways to understand them. So I'm just going to talk about some of the different thinking styles that we can use to improve upon these skills. But the good news is you should be able to apply these thinking styles to anything you're currently working on. So the first up is creative thinking, also defined as thinking outside the box. It looks for new and exciting ways of doing things. And it's also very closely linked to thinking on the spot. So I don't know if anyone's been in a situation where somebody asks you a question and you answer it, you're happy enough, but then later you're maybe sitting with your cup of tea or your glass of wine and the most amazing answer comes to you and suddenly you're kicking yourself that you didn't think of it then. Or somebody's asked you to come up with a design or a concept or fix a problem, and your mind's just not in it that day. The coffee hasn't kicked in. And so thinking creatively can be one of the most hardest forms of thinking. But luckily, research says that we can get better at this. And that's just by doing a few simple brain exercises. So you could take a mixed up word, put it into alphabetical order. You can try some free writing. So that's just taking a word or a concept and just trying to get those words on the page, try to keep that flow going. You can draw a picture, though if you're like me and your pictures are shocking, I prefer to stick with the mind mapping. But these definitely do get you into that creative way of thinking. Next, we have analytical thinking. So that's taking a large chunk of information and breaking it down into smaller pieces. So I'm assuming we've quite a lot of expert thinkers in the room today, because that's when you're working on, say, a large system and it's integrated with various bits and pieces. It's taking an understanding of how that's connected, and as a tester it helps me to take the time to understand that so I can almost think out of the box with it. And to get better at this way of thinking, we can read more, work on our mathematical skills, do some brain games, or simply learn something new. And this is a very new way of thinking for me, especially in everyday life, say working on my motorbike. I've recently learned how to change a clutch lever, drain the oil tank, change the brake discs, which is something I never thought of before. Didn't think I was capable of it, but once you start to learn how those various components go together, it suddenly makes more sense. And then finally, we have creative thinking, one of the most important forms of thinking as a software tester. And it's really about asking those right questions. So if somebody gives you a design or an acceptance criteria, it's really being able to question that rather than accepting it at face value. And so to get better at this, we can ask, well, what's at stake here? What might the thought of the users be? And how can we make this better? And I really love that question, well, how do we make this better? Because isn't that what we're trying to trying to achieve, no matter what it is we're working on? So I try to use all three of these styles of thinking. I try to get a bit more creative, to get thinking on the spot more. I try to get a bit more critical to make way for improvements. And this year, I'm putting a heavily strong focus on upping my technical skills and getting those automation skills back up and running. So that analytical way of thinking should really help me out here. So it would be great for, say, this time next year to stand up and give a more technical talk and talk maybe about tips and tricks of automation. But until then, the lesson for today is to remember that different testing activities require different thinking processes. And when we take the time to understand the different thinking styles, we can begin to ask the right questions. Just want to say quickly, thank you very much. Hope you found bits of that insightful. And if anybody's interested in any QA testing roles, Explio is currently looking, so feel free to come and talk to me at the end if it's something you'd be interested in. Other than that, has anyone got any questions?
There. Talk amongst yourselves.
Hiya, that was really good, thank you. I just have a question about test scope. I find that with manual testing, it's harder to define the scope of what you should test for. And do you have any tips on how to prioritise what's more important than what's not? Because you can't test everything.
Yeah, and I suppose it really depends on the project itself, but I think it's just eliminating the risks and finding out what is those major things that could go wrong and working your way through those. And like you say, you can't achieve everything, so it is just about prioritising the areas with the most risks. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sweet. All right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ciara.